Here we go. Okay, hello everyone again, and welcome to this fifth appointment of our Muslim Wars Network seminar series. Today we have the pleasure of hosting Tanya Luhrmann, who actually doesn't need much introduction, but I will anyway give some information about Tanya and Tanya's work. Anyway, today she will present a talk titled Knowing God, which is largely inspired by her last book, which is How God Becomes Real, published 2020. But Tanya Marie Luhrmann is the Albert Ray Lang Professor of Anthropology at the Stanford University with a courtesy appointment in psychology. Her work focuses on the edge of experience, on voices, visions, the world of the supernatural, and the world of psychosis. She has published over 30 op-eds in the New York Times, and her work has been featured in the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, the Times Literary Supplement, Science News, and many other publications. Among other publications, she's the author of Persuasions of the Witchcraft, 1989, The Good Parson, 1996, Of Two Minds, 2001, When God Talks Back, 2012, and Our Most Troubling Madness, 2016. Currently, she's also working on a book tentatively entitled Voices, about which you want to, of course, hear more in the near future. Said this, I give Tanya the floor, and please. Thank you again for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to learning from people. I know, I am shy when I talk to people who know so much about Islam because my knowledge is so limited, but I'm so grateful for the conversation. I'm going to share my screen, and I also wanted to say that there'll be a moment at which we will be interrupted, or the fourth wall of the theater will come down and the puppies will be picked up, and I will have to step away from the screen for about 3 minutes to help them get into their van. All right. So I began to think about the problem of how God comes to feel real, or how spirit comes to feel real, back in the 80s. I was a graduate student in anthropology, of course, and I was in a very philosophical department. I was hanging out with philosophers, and the anthropology book that the philosophers loved was Evans Pritchard, Witchcraft, Oracles, and Magic Among the Azande. Basically, as of course you know, a story of how apparently reasonable people come to believe in apparently unreasonable beliefs. And the answers that the philosophers all gave, in one form or another, circled around the question of what it meant not to have access to science. And so I thought I would go to spend time with a group of people in London who had similarly sorts of unreasonable beliefs, but who were clearly exposed to ideas about science, and try to do a similar kind of project. And what happened was that rather than talking about belief, I mean, belief is obviously important, but what I was struck by was that people experienced spirits. People felt magical power moving through their body. They talked about interacting with gods and goddesses. And that struck me as terribly important. People said this when I hung, and this was my ethnographic inference, that people said that if I wanted to understand them, I needed to practice. That practice was crucial, and they had something more or less hand-wavingly equivalent to prayer and ritual. They were clear that some people were better than other people at experiencing this supernatural, magical stuff, but that everybody who practiced would feel something. And so that's led over the last few decades to the work that I summarize in this book called How God Becomes Real. And what I argue in this book is that coming to feel, and it's not coming to feel that God is real requires effort. I'm not making a claim, I'm not beginning with a claim that God is not real. I am thinking about the question of how God comes to feel real to people, and what an anthropologist with a foot in psychology can say about that. And so by effort, I'm talking about ritual and prayer and special behavior and special stories. And what I do in this work is I set out two different domains, for want of a better term. I talk about the faith frame, or the world of belief, which is the commitment that God is real. This is the kind of way that you think, the kind of way that you talk when you talk about the realness of gods and spirits. And then there's a story of kindling or experience, a story of how God comes to feel real to people. And I want to make two observations to begin with. Um, the first observation is that when I spend time with people who are religious, and for me that's primarily been evangelicals in the last chunk of years, although I spent time with Zoroastrians and with the magicians, and I've been in a Baal Tshuva shul and in a Black Catholic church. I mean, I've spent time in many different domains, many different religious domains. But what people are constantly saying that they don't believe enough. That's just something that people are articulate about, that they want to be praying always, but they're not. They're kind of, washing the dishes. They want to be aware of God all the time, and they're just not. And what I observe is also people treat their, let's call it belief, in a way that's constrained. And my the way I talk about this is this: nobody ever asks God to feed the dog. People can tell you that God can do anything. They can be extremely committed to that point of view, but in fact, that's not the way they behave. They behave as if they reach out for God and particular circumstances with particular expectations. And we can spend more time talking about this, but I begin with a premise that there's something epistemically different about the way in which people hold their commitments to gods and spirits, and the way that they hold their commitments to the everyday world. And they need to do something. They feel they need to do something to make God feel present for them. And by kindling, I mean that there are these small acts that help God to feel more present to people, and that we can say something about the ways in which God comes to feel more vividly, viscerally present. So this is a story about, also describe it as real making. And I basically have 6 factors, for want of a better term, that I have seen in my work that help to describe or help me to understand how people facilitate the sense that God comes to feel real. And of course, they all just happen to begin with the letter P. So there's a story about paracosm, about proclivity, about practice, about phenomenology, about porosity, and there's so much more to say about prayer. I am sure that there are other factors that facilitate the sense that God is real. I just want to make a claim that I have found a role for these factors in my work. So let me begin with paracosm. So a paracosm is the name for a shared imaginative world. So the world, so famously the shared world that the Bronte children developed together. The paracosm that's probably most known, it's easiest to describe to contemporary folks, is Harry Potter. Many people know a lot about Harry Potter. And there's this kind of this sort of funny paradox, which is that the more you know, the more detail there is in this paracosmic world, the easier it is to make it your own. So the more you know about Harry Potter, the more you're able to become a kind of a fan fiction writer and retell the story of Hermione so that she's really in love with Snape, and you tell the story as if it belongs to you and as if you have a place in that story. I think spiritual worlds are paracosms. So in a Christian context, what I see is that people sort of spend time, what happens in a Bible study is that people are, they're meeting together once a week and they're retelling the story of the prodigal son, and somebody can say, that happened to me on Tuesday. That's a sentence people generate. And so and there's something about being able to take these stories and rework them so that you see yourself within them. Okay. One of the reasons that paracosms are so important is that people come to have a set of ideas about who God is and how God shows up and how you recognize that. And one of the things that I saw, oops, what's happened to my mouse? So this is I love this picture of charismatic Christians. These are people who they're closely together. They are in a social world and they want desperately to have a personal, individual relationship with God. They want to experience God as talking back to them. And one of the things I saw is that this is a woman who's describing how she comes to understand God speaking to her, and she says something like this: "I'm praying for someone, and they describe their situation, what would they want me to pray for? I start praying, and I start trying to really experience God, and I see these images, and I'm explaining these vivid images, and I'm checking in with a person. Do these images resonate you?" And they're like, "Oh my gosh, how did you know that?" And so what's happening is that this is one person praying for another person, and she's getting a bunch of mental events in her mind. And she's picking out which of these mental events is not her thought, but it's actually God. And as I hear people talk about this, I see two things going on. I see that there's a story about what I think is pretty common to many faith. I think it's a pretty humanly common experience that thoughts that pop into the mind, thoughts that feel stronger, thoughts that feel that they've been spoken out loud. They're more likely to feel as if they come from outside of you. But there's a way in which also people look for particular kinds of thoughts that are particular to the way in which they understand this God. They understand how this God is meant to be talking, and they come to look for those experiences of God, and that's part of the paracosm, the sort of the narratives that people use to interpret their own mental experience that shape their experience. Okay, there's a story about proclivity, and by this I mean some people more than others. So for years now, I've been using a scale. So this is I've got this foot in psychology. I do the psychological work along with this ethnographic work. I do that because I'm interested in these ephemeral, hard to pin down experiences, and helps to give me a little bit more confidence that I'm seeing something that um, and it helps me to persuade people that what I'm seeing is really there. Anyway, I started giving this scale to people and this really started with Christians, but I've now given it to other kinds of people. This is the scale developed by Auke Tellegen. It's got 32 items, and you can see some of the items. I think when we look at the scale carefully, and two of my collaborators are statistically very competent. When we look at the scale with their statistical techniques, we think that they have this scale picks up two underlying orientations in the people who say true to the items. There's one set of orientations which is about vivid sensory experiences. My most vivid memories are called up by scents and smells. I like to watch clouds change shape in the sky. People who say true to these kinds of sentences like, like being caught up in sensory experience. There are also a set of items that, in effect, ask you to engage in what you could call a pretend stance or an as-if stance, or to hold things with epistemic flexibility. Things like, if I wish I can imagine or daydream things, something so vividly that they hold my attention as a good movie or a story does. It's somehow, that you say true to that kind of item. I think you're signaling that you're willing to kind of hold things otherwise than they might appear in the material world. In any event, this is what I see again and again and again. People who mark more truths on that scale have more vivid experiences of God. That it's remarkably robust. I recently did, this is a review that I did with some young psychologists recently, looking at different kinds of religious groups and also looking at folks who take psychedelic psychedelics. If folks who take psychedelics, they have more vivid experiences if they score more highly in absorption. Another factor is practice. So let me describe what I mean. So some years after I wrote my book on magic, I met this young blonde Californian woman who told me that if I wanted to understand her God, I needed to have coffee with him. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And so that led me into this, years of ethnographic work in churches like this. And so let me just say a little bit about what I saw. If you enter a church like this, you've got to you learn that that your mind is not private, but that thoughts and images and sensations you might have understood as self-generated are really God speaking. And you need to learn how to understand that. You have to pick out thoughts in your mind that are not yours, but are God's. So here's somebody who's saying, when people are praying over me and I'm just receiving it, and all of a sudden I hear, go to Kansas, which is where her parents live. Because I'd been debating whether to go to Kansas, but I hadn't been thinking about it within a 24-hour period. So again, there's this quality that thoughts pop in, and you have to pick out which thoughts those are. And people say that they get better at doing this, and the thoughts become stronger, they stand out more. They're learning to practice talking with God. And what they're doing when they're talking with God kind of looks a lot like this. Sometimes they're alone, sometimes they're with other people. They've got their eyes shut, and they are doing something in their mind. And they're doing two things, I think. They are doing what you could call bluntly and crudely mental imagery cultivation. They're using their imaginations to represent, in the case of evangelicals, they've got God, they're sitting on a park bench and God's arm is around their shoulder, or they're standing in the throne room, they're trying to feel the heat of his power on their cheeks. So they're using technically they're using these inner pictures, inner words, and they report that when they pray, that imagery comes to feel more vivid. They're doing something like imagining that God is there. So they're often very sophisticated in thinking about the mixture between what they as humans bring to this experience and how God is present. And there's much more to say about that. But what's striking is that when somebody comes to a church like this, and they sometimes come and say, well, God doesn't talk to me. After they pray for many months, they say things like, I recognize God's voice the way I recognize my mom's voice on the phone, which is quite a striking claim. This experience is not meant to be an auditory experience. You can buy many hundreds of books that teach you how to pray and how to hear God speak. And most of them say something like this: God's voice sounds like a flow of spontaneous thoughts. But in fact, in my experience, maybe 1/3 people at some point heard God speak in a way they could hear with their ears. So, you know, so this is a young woman who said, "Well, the Lord spoke to me clearly in April and May or April to start a school, and I, the inquisitive anthropologist, say, you heard this audibly. Yeah, were you alone? Yeah, I was just praying. I wasn't praying anything really, just thinking about God, and I heard start a school." And so she has some kind of auditory quality of the experience. It's as if the inner experience comes to feel more external, feel more as if it's not hers, and it stands out, and it's not her, but it's really God. And you can actually, sorry, that we just found this is one of my postdocs who led did this big study, and turns out that the minutes per day that you pray, to use the language of cognitive science, predicts how many vivid experiences, or whether you have vivid experiences of God. It turns out that these prayer practices are you don't need God to produce these kinds of experiences. And so recently I've been spending time with people who call themselves tulpamancers. These are humans. This is an internet phenomenon. And they are seeking to create a tulpa, which is an imaginary friend. This is a visualization or a representation of one of these imaginary friends. And what I see is that, we flew 25 of them out to California and spent 4 hours with them talking to them. And one of the things that they, unlike the Christians, are completely happy having little tabs on their landing sites that explain how to create a tulpa. And there are two techniques that they use to create tulpas. One is careful mental imagery training. So somebody wants to become a tulpamancer, will decide kind of who they want their friend to be. Like, let's say they want a fox. They shut their eyes and they vividly imagine that fox in their mind's eye. They look at the nose, they look at the ears, they look at the tail, they try to draw the whiskers. And the second technique is they call the narrative technique. You just talk to the tulpa as if the tulpa is there. And what they describe is that over time, some will say a few weeks, some will say a few months, they will experience that this invisible being comes to feel autonomous and sentient. And it feels as if it has sort of emerged for them. These folks start without any metaphysical commitments at all. And so it becomes often a bit confusing because they know that this is a psychological technique, but they experience their tulpa as real. And then they have lots of complicated metaphysical understandings of how to make sense of that phenomenon. Here's another thing that I see, that that the way that you think about thought matters. So I think I'd be willing to say that there's something profoundly human about the way that humans think about thoughts. That, in some sense, that people. So I think that humans distinguish between the experience of consciousness and the experience of mind, the experience of their body, the experience of the world. They draw the line in different ways. It's very complicated, but phenomenologically, the humans recognize the experience of thought. And I think that you can mount an argument that humans in general end up with a default model that thought is located inside, that it's private, other people can't see your thoughts, that they're your thoughts. They have a quality of what William James called minus. And in general, they don't seep out into the world to act on their own. But humans everywhere have experiences that violate that default model. So people dream. I'm guessing everybody in this audience has had a dream that felt powerful, so powerful it didn't quite feel like it came from inside them. It seemed to have knowledge that came from outside. We have moments when anger, at least we in English, we use words that suggest that anger swept over us, it overwhelmed us, that the poem came to us, that these thought-like things can somehow enter your mind as if they're not really yours, even though you might really understand that they are. And I want to make the argument that there are ideas like cursing, like prayer, like inspiration, like inspiration or witchcraft, that these are ways in which cultures, in effect, capture these intuitions and make them allowable inferences to make about everyday experience, so that it becomes understandable, that reasonable, that prayer could play a role in healing somebody, that a curse could hurt somebody else's body, that a song really could come from a muse. Much more to say about that, but I'm going to talk about this as porosity, the idea that the mind-world boundary is permeable in non-ordinary ways. And now I quickly want to tell you about a project that a group of us did between 2016 and 2019, and this is the core group, all sophisticated ethnographers who worked in different parts of the world, and a couple of psychologists. And we worked in 5 parts of the world, and the field workers did these open-ended, long conversations with religious folks, half of whom were charismatic evangelical and half of whom were not. And to my great sadness, we did not end up working with any Muslims. So the intuition behind the project was that there was a relationship between the way people thought about thought and the vividness of their experience of gods and spirits. So the ethnographers did these rich, open-ended interviews, one on mind and one on the experience of God, which we tweaked in various ways to adjust to the different populations they were talking to. They also trained research assistants to do short versions of these interviews and face-to-face encounters with the general population at like insurance, when people in a place where people were standing online. And we handed out surveys to undergraduates. As we were doing this, we asked questions about porosity. So some of these questions were vignettes. So we told a story like, suppose that in a distant community that's very much like this one, there's a woman named Martha. One day, Martha realizes that her neighbor is really angry at her. She's been angry for a long time. And the field workers did a lot of probing. Do you think that Mary could hurt Martha just by thinking about her? Well, supposing that Mary was a special kind of person, supposing that Mary had special kinds of gifts, supposing that she spoke special words or used a special tool, is there any way that Mary could hurt Martha? And then we asked that question about anger and also about caring. We also had a scale, and there were items like this. Spirits can use thoughts and feelings to hurt people. Evil thoughts can go directly into the world like Wi-Fi or radio and cause bad things to happen to people without a spirit's help. So 16 items like that. And so what we found was that no matter where we went, no matter how we asked the question, the more porosity this individual said yes to, the more voices and visions and vivid experiences of God they reported. And the more absorption they said yes to, the more voices and visions and experiences of God they reported. So we're still trying to figure this out. That was the first place we reported it, but we've just working with Kara Weissman, who led this paper. We just we went on to Prolific and gave a bunch of questionnaires to 2,000 people. So what does that teach you? Well, I don't know, but this is what we saw. That's kind of cool. So the first thing we saw is that, that list of porosity questions, nobody says yes to all of them. The people say yes to some of them, and some people say yes to more of them than others, but very, very few people are endorsing all of them. Here's the second thing. Everybody's endorsing something, even if they are atheists. So here's these ideas about the mind, that somehow thought is potent, it can affect the world, and even atheists are saying yes to at least one of those items. Moreover, so here in this group of 2,000 people, there was a biggish group of people who were spiritual but not religious. They are the pink people, and they're a bunch of Christians. They are the green people. We know so little about these people. These are people that, where we contact through the internet. But this is really interesting. We've got this list of questions down, or list of items down the side here, and we ask people whether they agree with them. It does not happen, it might happen, or it definitely happens. Like very, very few people endorsed it definitely happens. But the thing that's kind of interesting is that these two groups, the pink group, spiritual but not religious, and the green group, the Christians, they endorse some items more than other groups. So the spiritual but not religious people, they say, oh, if somebody's sick and you really think about them, thinking can make a difference. They like that item. The Christians are much more likely to like items that seem to mention God and spirit and God and prayer. So it's not entirely surprising, but still pretty striking. So there's some kind of story like this porosity that we're still trying to figure out what porosity is, but something about this kind of permeable boundary between the mind and the world in which thought becomes potent. It is robustly in our work again and again. People who say true to those items are more likely to have vivid experiences of God and spirits. That idea about porousness is accessible even to atheists. And these ideas are culturally variable, meaning that different groups of people endorse different kinds of items. And that's kind of interesting. It suggests that this is a cultural phenomenon, not a psychological phenomenon. And so this is the way that we talk about it, that a person is more likely to hear God speak or feel God's presence or have other vivid experiences of God if they've got epistemic flexibility, cultural support, and cultivated skills to shift temporarily away from a mundane model of mind in a more porous way of thinking and feeling, and the capacity to immerse themselves fully in this experience of porosity. So this is the way that we represent this is the way that we model what's going on. So often people are in this kind of bounded understanding of the way that thought works and the way, and this is one of the problems of feeling that God is real, is that you live in this everyday material world in which you can't see God and God's not, so, and we know that people struggle with that. If people are higher in absorption, or if people are the kinds of people where they're more likely to stay true to the absorption items, they're probably a little bit more epistemically flexible. They're a little bit more able to fold competing understandings of what's true. They're probably a little bit more likely to be interested in vivid sensory immersion. So they're a little bit more likely to trust their imagination. if they are praying, if they're practicing again and again and again, then they are practicing holding the possibility that God is listening, God is responding, God is available. And if there's cultural support for these ideas, they're more likely to have vivid experiences of God. So what I've said so far is that I've seen so I described the paracosm ethnographically. That's what emerged from my anthropological work. And from anthropology and from these more structured interventions, we see that practice, proclivity, and porosity, those three factors travel together to make it more possible for people to put it in secular terms, facilitate the experience of thought as not one's own and not inside. Again, and I think to understand how this, and I'm not saying that God is not real. I'm trying to model how people come to have the experience of God being present. So when this is facilitated, people have new phenomenological events, which they associate with gods and spirits. I think this phenomenology is crucial. Spirits speak to people. That's how people know that God is there. So this is Gabriel speaking to Mary, telling her she's about to have God's child. Abraham only knew that Yahweh existed because Yahweh spoke to him. My understanding is that Gabriel dictated the Quran to Muhammad. That's how Muhammad knew that God was speaking. The disciples knew that Jesus had survived his death because first they saw him as a ghost and then he spoke to them. These experiences really matter. They happen to people. Let me skip this. This is the experience of Martin Luther King Jr. So Martin Luther King Jr. is at the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycotts. He has gotten death threats against him and his family. He wasn't sure about whether he was going to go forward. And he sat at his kitchen table and he prayed, and he heard God say that he would be with him. And that enabled him, in his experience, that enabled him to believe that God would be present, and he went forward. So there are all kinds of flavors of unusual, powerful experiences of gods and spirits. It's one of the things that we've been doing recently. So I think there's a common structure to these experiences. This is, do I feel completely confident about this? No, but I think reasonably confident that in talking to many different people, and so this also comes out of what we saw in that big project. It comes out of our follow-up study with these 2,000 people. We're going to do another follow-up study to that. But what we see when you ask people a series of questions about how they have experienced God, and actually our aim is to ask these questions of Muslims through the internet as well. When you ask people how they experience God, has God ever spoken to you in your mind? Has God ever given you a picture in your mind? Have you ever felt a sensation that you felt came from God? Have you ever heard God speak in a way you could hear with your ears? Have you ever seen something with your eyes that you felt from God? Have you ever smelled a smell that was not a real smell, but a smell that came from God? Have you ever felt that God was present? Have you ever felt that God was present in a particular place in the room? Have you ever felt that a demon was present? So, and then have you ever had an experience of being awake but unable to move, which is the key question to ask about sleep paralysis? Have you ever had an experience when you seem to leave your body? Have you ever felt that a spirit entered your body and took control over you? Have you ever seen that a spirit changed its shape in front of you? So it turns out that there's a pretty common frequency structure in the way that people respond to these questions. These paraordinary events, they're always the most common, and they seem to respond most to prayer. So meaning that you say something, you're really blunt. You say, how many minutes a day do you pray? And the more people say that they pray, that has the greatest effect on the frequency of these paraordinary events. And then felt presence hallucinations, those are the next most frequent, and they're a lot less frequent, and they respond a little bit to how much people pray. And these other experiences, like you very rarely get possession or shape shifting in a culture where people don't, if that's not part of their understanding of how God manifests. Sleep paralysis can be interpreted as a spiritual experience, often as a demonic experience. Doesn't seem to be associated with how vividly people pray. Anyway, so there's something to say about a kind of a common structure to human spiritual experience, but there's also like a culturally specific story to tell as well. So there was work I did with Julia Casanidi, who is an anthropologist now at the University of Virginia. Her area is Thai Buddhism. And so we compared interviews about spiritual experience, I with evangelical Christians and she with Thai Buddhists. And what we found was that these American evangelical Christians, they love experiences in which God shows up and surprises them. It proves to them that God was really there. The Thai Buddhists don't like those kinds of experiences. So Thai Buddhists were much more likely to say that periods of calm or were special moments in which which were spiritually important to them, but were not particularly evidence of God or a spirit. They were somehow different. And so we saw a kind of different pattern to the kinds of spiritual events that people reported. The Thai Buddhists did not describe spirits talking to them in their mind. They did describe the presence of evil spirits. Many more Thai Buddhists regarded sleep paralysis as a spiritual experience, and they described it more frequently. They also gave it a name, which the American charismatic Christians, for the most part, did not. And that's where we described this. Okay, I just have a couple more things to say. I want to say that this is a deeply social story. So I'm talking about mental events, thought-like events that probably to some extent come to feel as if they are not your own. I think that there's a thinking about this theologically. I'm not going to go there, but there's some kind of, if God is speaking through the human mind. And humans have to come to recognize and understand this experience. These experiences happen within a social world in which other people are weighing in, commenting, encouraging, discouraging the understanding of these events. These are mentalish events. Spirit is a social relationship. This is, I think, the most powerful and moving thing that I've seen in all my decades of research. That God, for the people that I've spent time with, works as a social relationship. There's so much to say, so much more to explore and understand about this. But it's really important, or I have been profoundly moved by understanding that God functions to some extent as a person among people for people of deep faith. Prayer is a social practice, even when somebody is alone in their own room and praying. There is a great deal of prayer, at least for Christians, that works like cognitive behavioral therapy. It asks people to attend to their thoughts, to emphasize positive thoughts, to redirect your negative, niggling, angry, irritated thoughts to gratitude and appreciation. it does so in a social setting in which somebody is speaking to another mind who can understand and to some extent respond. Okay, why should any of this matter for anthropology? I think so. I just have a couple of things to say about this. I think this matters for anthropology because religion should not be understood to be all about belief. And I think that focusing first and foremost on belief really invites anthropologists to focus on what they understand to be false belief. That becomes the problem of how apparently reasonable people can believe in apparently unreasonable beliefs. I think taking God or spirit seriously does not mean that we're assuming that God or spirit is real or accurately represented. It just means avoiding the presumption that God or spirit is a lie. And here I'm following Durkheim's lead and his observation that religion cannot be founded on a lie. I think it's an invitation. I would like to invite people to listen to the way people talk about mystery and doubt. That we should not assume in a simple-minded way that people believe unambiguously what they say about God. That this is complicated. People hold ideas about God in epistemically different ways. You can see this in the ethnographic literature. David Graeber sees this, for example, or saw this. But sometimes anthropologists write as if belief is straightforward and simple, and that really invites the reader to think about what the anthropologist is describing as a problem of false belief. I think it's really important to explore the way that God works as a social relationship for many people. I suspect that is true in Islam. I had an argument with Mira Mittermeier at one point about whether it was possible to study this, but I suspect that it is even in Islam, where God, there is a single dominant, powerful God, but that God is unrepresented. Niloufar Harari, in her book on prayer, did invite us to seem to think that her Tirani women had a back and forth relationship with God when they prayed. I don't think we know nearly enough about the way this social relationship works. I think we can't assume that it works just the way that our ordinary social relationship works. We need more kind of biographies. I love Anna Maria Rizzuto's book on what's it called? The Living God. Anyway, she has a psychoanalytic book about the way that God becomes real for people. And I don't write enough about this. I think that we just need people to understand, to explore these relationships more deeply and not to make simple assumptions about how they work for people. And finally, I just think we need to respect the fact that the humans that we're spending time with are as puzzled by gods and spirits as the anthropologists are. And our work should really reflect that. And that's not to disrespect anyone. That's to recognize that this is really hard. So I'll stop at this point. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Tanya, for this engaging presentation, which really spans over a lifelong work on religions. And so yeah, I open the floor to anybody who might have a question. I see Leila raising her hand for us first, so she will have the honor to be the first one to pose a question to Tanya.
Hi, Leila.
Yeah, Leila, please. God, yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. It is a fascinating theme, and I think that everybody who was listening can imagine about something personal. So that is why it is even more interesting. My first question, actually, maybe simple one, is why you decided to study this theme? Did you have your own experience of the same? And the second question is about your conclusion. One of your conclusions. You are writing that spirit is a social relationship, could it be that it is because you were studying the social communities, Buddhists or Christians, but you were not able to recognize among just ordinary people or non-community people some this spirit? Maybe it is not a social relationship if it is individual and not connected to any tradition. Thank you.
Great questions. So why did I walk down this path? Well, part of it is that when I was young, I grew up as my mom was the daughter of a Baptist pastor. My mother's sisters were deeply conservative Christians. My father, it was the son of a Christian scientist, and he went to medical school. So, if you're a Christian scientist, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to go to doctors. And so my dad's dad would call him up and try to figure out what he was doing in New York when he was in medical school. And I grew up as in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood among people for whom I played the role occasionally of a Shabbos Goy, which means that you have very deeply religious folks. They don't touch electricity between Friday sundown and Saturday sundown. And so it is not a violation of the faith to invite in a little Goyish girl to do that for you. And I could see that confused my mom, even though she'd strayed from the faith, and but it confused her that this was like doable. And then when I was beginning to hang out, so that's why I was interested in belief and here are all these good people. They have fundamentally different ideas about what's real, and what's up with that. I thought that was the first thing. But when I started to spend time with the magicians and witches, I started having vivid experiences, and I was really struck by that. That that was, you didn't have to have theological ideas or commitments, but people felt the power. Oh, that was really interesting to me. And then they would say things about this. And so that's really when I became more interested in these experiences. And I have this parallel track of my life studying psychiatric phenomena. And my work in psychiatry sort of taught me that you could actually study these unusual experiences. And that's what led me to try to want to understand what was going on. Okay, social relationships. I don't think that people need to have a social relationship with spirit. And certainly many scholars of Buddhism have kind of, that's like, that will argue with me when I talk about this. But I think some people do. So it's the fact that some people do that I think captures my attention, because I think it's really easy for particularly secular anthropologists to think about religion as a puzzle of a belief about the world that just isn't true. And so like a propositional claim. And I think to recognize that there's a back and forth social dimension is important. I mean, for example, I think that many people in different faiths, certainly in Christianity and among folks who call themselves witches or Zoroastrians, they feel less lonely when they have a rich, you could say they have a belief in God, but I think they feel less lonely because they have a social experience of God. They feel more as if another being is present. And then it's our job to try to understand, well, on this side of the human-God relationship, how do we describe what we can see about how that becomes possible?
Thank you very much for your answers.
Raymond.
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Thank you for that wonderful talk, Tanya. I really appreciate it. I've read quite a bit of your work, and thank you for providing the new references in cognitive science and topics of cognitive science. And so I'm going to look into that too, to get a better understanding. Have you engaged with the work of Edith Turner in your work at all? And if so, how has she influenced you, or do you see some parallels with her work and your work?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I love Edie Turner. I am really struck by the fact that if you read into that famous moment where she sees the, what is it? There's the tooth that emerges from the back of the Ndembo person's back. Is it the Ahamba? So she sees a Hamba presence. I hadn't realized until I read into that she is taking a hallucinogen at the time. That's kind of interesting. It's a mild hallucinogen. But I think that's interesting. She was so determined that people should take spiritual experience seriously, just because she felt that you're not going to understand religion unless you do. And I'm pretty sympathetic to that. She was also willing to walk farther down this path in which she was so insistent that people should take spiritual experience seriously that she was also pretty able to say that if you didn't that what she experienced was ontologically true, it was really there. So I myself don't go there. I think that she played an important role for the field in agitating the reader.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay.
Any other question? Sasha?
Yes.
Sasyatko? Yes, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you for the wonderful lecture and then presentation. I'm an anthropologist from Russia, and I'm currently doing my PhD about Parsi Zoroastrian community in India.
Cool.
Yes.
That's so cool.
So I've read your book about Parsis, obviously. So my question is, what I saw that people actually mix a lot of ideas. They can identify Zoroastrians, but they would also believe in Hindu gods and also in Sai Baba and and also maybe something spiritual. So can we actually create these borders and identify them as strictly Christians or strictly atheists, strictly spiritual? Where is the border between them?
It's a great question, and I should send me a note. I'll send you because the paper that I read about the religion, the Parsi religion, doesn't end up in the book because the editors made me shorten the book by 10,000 words like overnight. Anyway, I will send me a note. I'll send you that paper. I think that's a really important question to ask in any particular community. So, depending on the community, the borders of the faith are tightly policed or not. With Parsis, the the community is so open anyway. There's so many different kinds of people in the community, and there is the theological politics are so charged. But so that's a tiny community in India. And so in this Hindu context, where many Hindus are very comfortable with a mixture of at least different representations of spirit, and often a sense that there are many, many spirits. And so I saw that also with the Parsis, that they had all kinds of different gods and goddesses and beings on their, on their altar, for want of a better term. I think it depends on the community. My next focus, I think, will be on the spiritual but not religious in America. It's a very rapidly growing community. It's a very rapidly growing chunk of the American population. And it is quite clear that people are often quite angry at the idea of a particular monotheistic God, but they have all sorts of ideas, and they're wildly eclectic. And it will matter, the degree of eclecticism will vary according to the dominant folks in the faith community. Anyway, I'd love to see what you find out. Let me know.
Thank you.
Okay. Faiza, hello, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I'm a big fan of your work.
Thank you.
I'm an analyst of Sufism, especially in Turkey, and writing my manuscript book right now. And many of the things that you studied and you come up with as a theory really resonates with my interlocutors in a very different way. So not like mapping onto each other, but like your idea of paracosm, the narrative. There's this cosmology of Wahdat al-Wujud, which is everything is a manifestation of God's names and attributes. So the Sufis that I work with live in an enchanted universe, right? Like everything is they say it's God, but it is like a reflection of God, manifestation of God, because they also believe the transcendental part of the God. It's not just immanent, not just like spiritual stuff. And one of my questions, like that I am, thinking about, is the question of agency in these scenarios. So one of the things is that I totally agree that you need to practice to be able to, let's say, yes, you may be acted upon, but you need to act first to be in that state, right? So I agree with you with that. But then two things. One, there are many cases in which there is no reflective conversion into Islam or any Sufism or anything. They just have this experience first. The experience comes first, and then they find their way to the Sufism to make sense of it. And in that sense, they literally don't take agency. Like I was, it came to me. I wasn't there. It wasn't me doing this word. This was not me doing this. This was not me, is very prominent in my field work. And also the second thing is what it does to social relations. Again, the agency. For instance, one of my interlocutors hated her father because of his domestic violence. Right? Say he was, beating her up when she was a kid. And then through, this new spiritual life, she forgives him. But why? Because now she thinks it was God doing it. So there's also this radical acceptance of evil as necessary as, for your own good. But then again, she is the way she can forgive the father is to take the agency of father from him. So I'm really in this, the agency question is a big one for me. And I was wondering, came up in your research as well, and how did you deal with it?
Yeah, so two really different questions, great questions. There is, I think it's Shane Sharp. There is a neat paper by a sociologist. I think it's Shane Sharp. I reference it in the penultimate the chapter on prayer in How God Becomes Real. And he raises, yeah, exactly. Thank you. My goodness. So he raises exactly that issue. Oh my goodness, that's so wonderful. Thank you. So he he interviews these domestic violence survivors, and they talk about how helpful prayer is. And they also talk about how prayer leads them to forgive. And he says, I'm not so sure that's great. It's, and so it's complicated because so you should come to a point of view about this because it is clearly an advantage, probably to the person, to come to feel that they were not responsible for the violence. And there are many invitations to forgive in these monotheistic faiths. And it's probably good for the body on some level to forgive. But that's very complicated. I mean, do we as observers, that's just very complicated. I mean, I feel I do feel uncomfortable about that. The problem of understanding the spontaneity is really interesting. William James grappled with this. He said, look, and William James fell on the side of no, 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 no. It's actually a slow process that the person's not aware of. They're thinking, they're not aware of this. I don't know whether that's always true. I think being in a particular community can be enough to have these experiences. The other thing so it turns out it's kind of complicated to try to persuade people who are outsiders to this field of study that there's both preparation and spontaneity. But that's true, that is what people experience, that however much they're praying, the experience feels spontaneous. And of course, it can't be an experience of God if it's not spontaneous, because it has to feel. I mean, it can't be, it is only an experience of God because the person did not generate it. If you feel that you're generating it, then it doesn't feel like it's outside of you. I think one of the puzzles for me, or one of the things I haven't really figured out yet, that you should figure out, is that there is this phenomenon of a big experience happening at conversion and then lesser experiences happening over time. So that's a real thing, that people sometimes have these traumatic events that persuade them to commit, and then other experiences are more modulated. It's not always the case. I mean, sometimes people do, have dramatic. I mean, there are Teresas among us, but that is a thing that I recognize, that the dramatic experience is often the initial one. It feels as if it's completely out of the blue, and then these more paraordinary experiences follow. And so, why that's the case, don't know.
Thank you.
Okay. Is there any other question?
Lily has a question.
Yes, I have a follow-up question to this idea of the experiences, because I'm also wondering, so first someone could have an experience, dramatic, but then through prayers or actually becoming accustomed to another way of sensing the world. And then, of course, the following experiences are not so dramatic because this person has already connected with the experience of the world that is already different from what was before. So how is it possible actually then to know this? Because of course, because in the sense that this person would be already in another mode over the years, and so the experiences, of course, will change from the initial conversion, etc. So I have some other questions, but.
So one way of thinking about this, and this is why I end up with a foot in psychology, there's a story about what's going on in the human body, and you might say the affordances of the human body. There's a story about what you might call ideology or theology, the expectations of how God should be. And then there's whatever space you want to give for the ontologically real. But in the interaction between, so what I can see is the relationship between the ideology and the body. And of course, we can only see this much of what's actually going on. So I do think that when people, have these dramatic initial experiences, I do think that they are often real experiences. They're not, they're vivid, powerful. I mean, you talk to people and it's very hard to feel, well, this person is just giving me a bunch of ideological stuff. Sometimes I do feel that way. Sometimes, I'm talking to somebody and what they're saying is, like the Christian conversion experiences. It's, there's this Christian conversion story in which, particularly with many evangelical churches, you're supposed to hit bottom and then, and then you're saved. And I remember for this one moment, one evening, listening to this woman talk to me about how her addictions and how she was unable to free herself from addictions. And I was thinking, oh my goodness. It was like, I mean, there was a young woman who told me that she realized that when she was cooking methamphetamine in her dad's studio apartment and she blew out the glass plate door, that God was trying to call her attention to what she was doing. So, it's, then this other woman, years later, I'm sitting in this living room listening to this woman talk about what sounds like an addiction to methamphetamine. And it turned out she was talking about being addicted to novels. And so, so there's a lot of ideology that floats around that is shaping people's willingness to describe their experience. But it's also true that there are dramatic experiences. So that's the challenge of the ethnographer, is to try to interview really carefully, to try to figure out, to at least feel confident for yourself what you think is going on. And I am struck that there probably is, I think there is enough of a human dimension for the capacity to have these experiences that it constrains what people can feel. But then there's this role in which the ideological interpretation may be playing a role in what's possible for them in the future. I mean, what do I think? Like people who get possessed. I joined a Santeria group for a while in the many walks of my life. And when people got possessed for the first time, they would often get possessed in a dramatic and noisy fashion, and they would lose awareness of what was happening. They would claim to lose, and I actually came to believe this was true, that they forgot what was happening when they were possessed. Over time, they were more able to become possessed under control, and they became possessed in a more manageable way. And Bambi Chapin, who wrote a wonderful article about possession, argues that this may be because they no longer psychically need the possession. It's not doing the same thing for them. But also they're more able to present themselves as possessed in a way that is kind of utilizes some of their psychic capacities to do so, but not all of them. Anyway, I think it's a complicated story worth exploring.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I have one question. And my question is more about the paracosm and this idea of religions as providing people with narratives, which has always been fascinating to me, maybe because I am a bit too much Assadian or McIntyrean. Alastair McIntyre in his work on Christianity, actually, in some passages of his work, stresses the idea of religious providing people with narratives. And with narratives, basically, it means that these narratives gives a telos to human action, so they give a direction. So I'm probably here bringing the discussion more to the rational dimension of religious behavior, which isn't exactly probably the focus of your book. But I was wondering if also from your own comparative perspective and with your footing psychology, as you said, about religion, if you dealt with this issue. I mean, how religions also gives kind of a talos of moral ethical dimension. So and how all this connect with your argument about religions in general. So so if you have anything to say about basically the religious dimension and moral and ethical behavior of people, how people connect, so their ethical behavior with their own religious narratives, basically.
Yeah, I think that that's really good. I think it's, ethical choices are really hard. Being a good person is tough. Requires a lot of effort. And so I see people really reaching out to these paracosms to help them make sense of themselves and other people. So that's partly the puzzle and the awkwardness of the domestic violence story, that you can really reach out and make sense of and come to terms with behavior that really oughtn't to be seen as ethical, and you can transform it into an ethical story. With this, in the Christianity, there are all these stories of forgiveness, and people really do. The prodigal son, in effect, has a lot to answer for, because it allows people to bring someone who really ought to be understood to be outside of the fold because of their behavior back into the fold. And of course, if it's a good paracosm, there are many ways to tell those stories. So that, of course, is even if you stick with the Gospels, there you can do a lot with interpreting behavior. You can give many different. Jesus in the Gospels is many different people. He is an avenger. He is a rebel. He is a peacemaker. His parents call him mad at one point. I mean, it's if you've got a paracosm that's rich enough, you can do whatever you need to do with it. And so that there, the community is making a big difference. How the community is shaping and molding and allowing some interpretations to be appropriate and some not. I mean, this is for evangelicals, one of the problems here is the problem of homosexuality. I mean, how do it's not at all obvious that a Christianity prohibits love between people of the same gender. But you can read and interpret the text to make that possible.
Yeah, so basically you're saying that these narratives can be some way managed by the communities, interpreted in different ways. So
Oh yeah.
Okay, so all these paracosms has different angles and different paracosms within themselves that can be interpreted differently. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
There's still space for one last question. Faiza, go ahead, please.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to, ask too many questions, but as we are talking about gender, I was wondering, the gender aspect of your research. And in my case, when women can experience, right, they have more agency in terms of male religious authorities vis-a-vis, and it gives them some space to actually act as a religious authority that they cannot get through just external institutional, practices. And I was wondering, or some, like the Sufis says, women are more capable of this, you call porous mind, they call heart, to call, that to communicate with God, women are always closer to it, like biologically, it's very essentialist. So did you think about the gender aspect of these experiences?
A great question. I am not so. If you were thinking like a psychologist, you would say that women score more highly in absorption on average. So women get a point more in absorption on average. What does that mean? I think that the allowability in different communities of who is the person of deepest faith varies. My sense of the way that medievalists, just people who study medieval Christian Europe, talk, is that women often behaved as if they were more religious and behaved as if they had more experiences, and that this was a source of untold anxiety to the church, who then had to decide whether they were truly experiences of faith or whether they were demonically possessed or misled. Yeah, I think, and why, if it is true that women have a more open heart, as it were, why should that be? I mean, women are, why should that be? I mean, that's just such that's just really interesting. Is that because women are, more likely to be the caregivers to children? Maybe that's okay. Okay, sorry, I'm about to travel. Hold on. Excuse me. I apologize for making you seasick.
No problem at all.
Sorry.
Please.
To the tour of my house.
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, I think that's an interesting puzzle.
Thank you for
You're
your
welcome.
answer. And Fabio, so do we have a last question? We still have some time.
Like a couple of minutes.
Okay,
Last
I will
chance.
have maybe a short question to finish the discussion. I was wondering if studying absorption, porosity, and as you said, you are not so convinced by the idea of viewing the religion as belief. So
Mhm.
has it led you to think more about knowledge and maybe anthropological knowledge? Because in reality, anthropologists are actually we are meant to be absorbing and have some porosity when we study communities and people. And so it's also maybe a form of knowledge that would differ from the idea of knowledge as taking some distance on what we study, being objective, and so on. So do you feel that maybe it has inspired you to think differently about anthropology and your journey as a researcher and someone who wants to find knowledge? And so this would be my
I kind of
question.
love that. That's great. I think so. I mean, I think that good anthropologists are sort of willing to immerse themselves in the world they've come to understand. And actually, that's a really interesting question. I bet anthropologists are a little higher in absorption than many folks. I love that.
So thank you for these
Okay.
last words. It's inspiring.
Yes,
Yes. So
I think
yes, I think it has really inspired us to think about all these questions of that you raise and this interesting vocabulary that you are suggesting we use. I think we could see that it also applies to Islam, as Faiza said about her studies. So thanks a lot for this really inspiring talk. I think we
yes,
will be fascinated to hear about your next book about voice. I think the title is Voices.
Yeah.
So it
voices. Yes,
sounds really nice. So thank you, and thanks to everyone for coming to the seminar series, and we'll soon make announcements for our next guest, and we will also have Amira Mittermeier joining us in autumn. So I think it will be a nice dialogue between Tanya and Amira. So thank you again, and have a
Thank you
nice
very
day.
much. And stay in touch. Okay.
Of course,
Okay.
of
okay,
course.
Bye-bye.
okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, Tanya. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Okay, let me do this.